How's it going, guys, and welcome to 4MR Ranch. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the LaserSpeed LS-M3, which is an updated offering for 2024. There's a lot of options out there in terms of these kind of laser units, and I am personally just curious to see how well it performs from a different variety of metrics. Now, depending on what you're interested in looking at, check the description below. There will be timestamps so you can skip around to see how this thing performs in those different categories. Now, for transparency purposes, I do want to disclose that LaserSpeed did send this my way, but I'm going to have analytics and data to support how this thing actually does, and they're not really going to be based on my personal opinion. Now, on the rear, the unit has your functions, and they're actually pretty straightforward. You can see in the center you have a switch that toggles from high to low. You'll also notice immediately that when it is not in the off position, a little LED indicator goes off. So currently this other selector is on V for visible. Now that'll either be your green or red laser depending on the model. This one is a red, but once I go over to I, you'll notice that LED indicator shifts, and that's because now we are on the IR spectrum, so IR aiming laser. I do also want to point out that that LED indicator is not turning off. Whenever the unit is powered on, the LED indicator is also on. So I will share my overall thoughts and opinions on that after now using this for a little over 500 rounds towards the end of the video. Just going to get you guys through the overall functionality and controls to orient you to this before we dive deeper into my use case. So moving on, L is going to be your IR Illuminator. C is going to be a combination of both the IR Illuminator as well as IR lasers, and then the S mode is actually a strobe, so it's going to be your IR laser and illuminator on strobe. You also notice that the LED is now blinking. Your Viz lasers are slaved together, so any adjustments made will be for both of them. I'm going to show you how well these are aligned later in the video. And on the opposite side is going to be your IR illuminator that diverges or converges with a rotation. And then this unit is powered with the CR123 battery, which is tethered with a nice steel cable. Simply just unscrews, and this is one of the first tethers that doesn't prevent me from actually opening up a unit. It actually works as a pretty functional tether. Also tethered on the rear is going to be this remote switch port. Once again, using a pretty decent tether that doesn't seem to bind up or get in the way. It actually works to do the job it was designed to do. Now, the actuation button is on top, and it is pretty tactile. You feel it, but it is not overly loud. It has nice texture to it. Doesn't feel like cheap, thin rubber that's going to tear over time. And overall, the build is pretty good. Now, speaking of pretty good, and this is going to start diving into the different test and data points I will collect for you. The turrets on this unit are all capped. The cap has a built-in tool, and you'll see that they're pretty tactile as well, and need a decent amount of force to rotate so they don't feel mushy or cheap at all. But let's go ahead and see how these perform with a basic tracking test. So next I went ahead and mounted this unit to a large block, which was clamped down to my workbench to make sure there was zero play, and I moved the turrets 30 clicks in the windage direction, then 30 clicks in the elevation direction, and then repeated the process in the opposite directions in an effort to see where the laser started, and ultimately ended up when making the same adjustments to test the quality of the components that were used inside the LS-M3. So this is a very superficial test, but it's still a data point I wanted to collect, and I'm happy to report that it returned exactly where it started when making the same number of adjustments. So one metric that I think is pretty important to talk about when it comes to a device like this is how well the lasers are co-aligned. So fortunately, this one is going to be pretty straightforward because you can see all these patterns are pretty tight and they are equidistant to the physical diodes on this unit. Therefore, they don't diverge over distance. So I did all this at 12 yards. I don't need to calculate what they would spread out to be at a further distance. So it essentially has zero divergence. But how did I collect this data? Well, I mounted this unit to the 4x4 block that seems to be really finding a place in my heart for these tests. I then marked where the visible laser fell on this target. I then switched to the IR spectrum, marked that laser, and then switched back to the visible laser to make sure that the laser had not shifted from my initial mark and skewed the results. So all these here were verified to not have shifted laser, and I'm pleased to say that these lasers are very well co-aligned, and I was pretty impressed by what we found here. Now, the next thing you guys are probably interested in is the actual power meterings for the different visible IR lasers and illuminators on this system. Now, in case you don't know what you're looking at, I have a meter that is calibrated for 633 nanometers, aka the red visible laser spectrum. So those values are 1:1. The other values have been converted for 830 nanometers, which is what LaserSpeed reports as the spectrum for their IR settings. Unfortunately, my meter caps out at 40 milliwatts on that red spectrum, and when converted, that ends up being only 28.4 milliwatts. I wish I had more budget for a more expensive meter, but the best I can do is tell you guys that the IR Illuminator is capable of greater than 28.4 milliwatts when converged as tight as it'll get and at point blank range. Now that's a total power output. It doesn't necessarily represent power per unit area. This is in milliwatts and not in milliwatts per meter squared. So for those that are really technical, just keep all that in mind. For those that don't care, here are your stats. Now, what good would this be if it consistently bounced around and lost zero? So I tested that out for you guys as well by first mounting onto my platform of choice and putting it on a tripod. Once I got it zeroed, I took a confirmation group, which you can see here, a nice tight pattern at what was 20 yards. I then went ahead and enjoyed my range session, did a lot of plinking around like I always do, and that's really what this channel is all about. So I had a good time with it and ended up getting around 550 rounds, which wasn't only 5.56. I did end up putting a little bit more oomph behind this laser to see if I could get those diodes to move around. All right, so got the LaserSpeed LS-M3. Let me just double tap it, see the laser's on. I'm gonna see how it holds up to recoil. Still on. Shotgun pushing me around a bit, it's pretty light. So, looks good. At no point when using this meter did I experience any shut off or flickering of the visible laser. And that goes for the IR laser as well. And at the end of 550 rounds, I shot another group and it was in exactly the same position as I had left it. So I think it's fair to say this thing has a pretty substantial chance of holding zero just fine. Okay, so what we have in front of us with the gain turned up so you know what it is that we are actually looking at, we have at the center of the screen is a white silhouette at 25 yards, and then there now centered in the screen and kind of silhouetted on that tree line is another white silhouette at 100 yards, and the tree line itself is actually around 450 yards away. I know depth can be hard to judge, and for size comparison, 80 yards is that tree to the right, and to the left that tree is a fairly large pond. So that is what you are currently looking at. I am going to go ahead and turn the night vision gain down so as not to wash out the illuminator too much, but I wanted to kind of orient you. Now I do need to give a huge shout out to Armorsight, because without them I would not have been able to capture the night vision footage for you guys to take a look at. Armorsight is completely supportive of the fact that I continue to test products that they don't necessarily sell or benefit from, but they are happy to support it for the good of the night vision community. So low vis laser on the LS-M3, and then I'm gonna go and point it at that 100-yard target. I'm aiming through a camera screen, so bear with me guys. There we go, 100-yard target right there. So low vis, Illuminator low, as wide as it can go at that 25 yards. And you don't really see it at that 100 yards, but I'm trying to give you a size comparison in terms of how much it diverges. Basically the size of that tree at 80 yards. Hopefully you can kind of see that, but we will switch to high here in a second. So there's dual low. Pretty usable. I'm gonna go ahead and focus that Illuminator on low. I'm going to put it back onto Illuminator only. So it makes that silhouette pop just a little bit. So especially at closer ranges, that Illuminator is definitely more than capable of being usable, and you can see how much it can focus to well within that silhouette. Again, almost a laser in itself at 25 yards. And it can get fairly wide. And there is a strobe function, for those that didn't know, on the LS-M3. So anyways, that's just a brief look at the low power. We're going to toggle it over to high power now. So there's laser high, obviously super bright at close ranges. No issue at all hitting something at 100 yards. It's still too bright. And you can see that that laser clearly and easily goes to that 500-yard tree line. So no surprise there. Let's look at the Illuminator. So we'll start out as wide as we can go. And I think you'll see what I mean now that you see that tree a little bit better. Larger than that tree at ADR. So reasonably wide. And even at the widest setting, no problem at all identifying that silhouette. Just pan it over at some brush. You can really see quite a bit. No issues lighting up that completely moonless night. By the way, hopefully this shows you, it is a pretty darn clean illuminator. A little bit of artifacts in the beam, but not too bad. So now what we're gonna do, I'll focus this beam. It's gonna absolutely be overkill. Now with how much this illuminator can converge to quite literally be a laser beam, if you're using this with like a night vision clip-on, I think it would actually be pretty decent given how much it, again, can narrow. And it's totally washing out the night vision even at almost 500 yards here. Super, super bright. So pretty usable, pretty useful. I am gonna switch to dual high, and that laser is still pretty spicy. A lot of reflection off that steel target. I have not centered the laser on the Illuminator, as you can see, guys, so don't hold that against this device. One thing I'll try to show you up against this is that as you change the convergence, right there you see that artifact on that illuminator. That does, I mean, it is a laser-based illuminator, so depending on how focused you are, the artifacts kind of change around a little bit, but overall still a pretty clean illuminator and a very, very strong laser. It would be useful to figure out some way to diffuse this laser so that you can take advantage of this dual high mode. But there you go, the LaserSpeed LS-M3. Now, I did not end up using the quick detach mount that was included. It is pretty easy to interchange. This bolt that was included in the unboxing portion basically just replaces the quick detach mechanism. Now, the reason I didn't use it is because you obviously need to set the tension to get it just right for the different tolerance rails you might be using. And this kind of leads me into one of the major issues that I had with this mounting system. But you can see this little notch where that aluminum is now showing. That is kind of an index point that you need to try to get this locking hardware. You can see that shape. It's supposed to index on those points, so you can only adjust the tension in increments of this geometry. The problem is this is a steel nut, for lack of a better way to describe it, with pretty sharp edges, and the body and that little notch there is fairly soft aluminum. So the reason the shiny aluminum is showing is because as I was trying to get it to clamp down and index in between those slots, it pretty much just started taking out that aluminum, then it gets wider, and then it doesn't seat at all. So I tried for a little bit, got a little frustrated, and eventually I just went and used the standard cross bolt. Once I got the nut lined up, then I was able to just, do about 20 inch-pounds, get it clamped to the rail, no issues. I think if I would have had a little bit more guidance, this was not clear in the included manual, what to kind of look out for, I probably wouldn't have messed that up the way that I did. But it is something to be aware of. I think if they were to use this mount, if they could replace that with a better material, or just have kind of better geometry, or chamfer this nut, I think it would avoid a lot of those issues. But it is one of the issues I ran into and wanted to make you guys aware of. Although I think I just tried to go too fast and made it worse. So once you get that index the proper orientation, and don't force it, I think is probably the best takeaway from this, because if you force it, you're gonna kind of smash that aluminum, and it's gonna be that much harder to get it to fit without having to file it down a little bit. So once it's in, you can just use the cross bolt and it'll tighten down like any other system. Just careful not to let it back out. Once you catch a few threads, it should be fine. And now it's going to work just like any other clamp. It's not going to be quick detach, but hey, this is going to save a little bit of headache in my opinion. Now if you want to be patient and try to mess with the quick detach mount, more power to you. I was kind of bummed out because I do like quick detach mechanisms, but it's easy enough to tighten down an Allen key as well. Now let's address the literal elephant in the room, and that is that this thing is big. It's heavy, 353 grams. For those that are familiar with the D-Ball D2, it is pretty much right there. I mean, to the nearest gram. It's right on the edge of that 353, 354. So somewhere in between based on the precision of this scale, but it is right up there with the D-Ball. And a lot of people think that the D-Ball D2 weighs a little too much. Now, when I first picked this up, I did notice like, wow, that pretty heavy unit. Now, similarly, in terms of footprint, it is not quite as tall as a D-Ball D2, but it is darn near close. So for comparison, if you are thinking this is going to be the lightest, most compact unit, it's not. That's not one of its strong suits. But other than the little mount concerns, this thing pretty much looks and feels like it is made absolutely solid. Now, for whatever reason, the reason you get so much height is that this mount is a little bit extended from the body, I think to make room for the turret mechanisms. If you look at the LaserSpeed FL5 for comparison, the mount is a little bit more streamlined to the body. You see the turret mechanisms are actually just a nudge below the location of this mount, whereas they pretty much dodged these since they are on different sections of the housing versus being all in one area like the FL5. It had to make the height a little bit taller to accommodate that. So there will be a gap by the distance of this mount. So there's an air gap in between the handguard or rail you're going to mount this onto by that height, whereas on their FL5, it's pretty much right up on the handguard, not giving any extra vertical space that is being wasted. So just something to keep in mind there. Okay, a couple more nuances here just to make you guys aware of. It does come with a switch, but it's obviously a very proprietary connection. So this is only going to be compatible with their devices. So if you have something like a crane plug in your collection, you're not going to be able to use it, although their switch is pretty decent. So just be aware, it is completely proprietary. And then the last little thing that I think really separates this from you being able to claim that this is perfect, because let me just reiterate, the lasers are perfectly co-aligned, the turrets are made very well, zero issues with reliability or loss of zero. But the one thing that I think will always probably separate this unit from being able to be called the perfect all-around laser is that when you turn it on, you automatically get a different colored LED based on what settings they're on. So to me, I think that's kind of redundant and honestly not very helpful, because I can see that it's on. The switch is not in the off position. That's already a really good visual indicator. I don't need this LED, because now when you go to mount it on a handguard and you're actually using it with the night vision device, you basically have a huge glowing LED coming right at you. Now, I would appreciate if they could tweak it to where, all right, like this one is set to IR. I'm gonna put it on low so I'm not bouncing IR light at myself, but it'd be nice if when it was activated, that light came on and only when it was activated. That I wouldn't mind, because then I know, ooh, whoops, the IR light is on. I can't see it because I don't have night vision devices in front of my eyes. But that's not the case. It's always on, so it's always going to be in your field of view. I don't want to end on a bad note, because like I said, this thing worked really, really well. The divergence range on this goes down to literally a laser and then gets pretty darn wide as well, and it's a very clean illumination pattern. So obviously you know what to expect in terms of power output, because I already metered that for you in the other part of the video, so I won't speak too much to that. I'll leave that alone, but I am happy, we'll put it like that, to see the power metrics that are coming out of these units. It's really difficult nowadays to get stuff like that, so it's nice to see some options out there for the average Joes that want a little bit more juice in those illuminators. This unit will absolutely do it. So everything feels really high quality, tactical switches. This now has over 500 rounds through it, and it's holding up. Nothing is falling apart, loosening up. Button still looks and sounds good. Overall, I think it's a pretty solid unit for what it is, and the price range that it comes in is fairly reasonable given the laser market that we find ourselves in. So if there's anything that I left out on this video, please leave a comment below. I try to be as responsive as possible. I'd be happy to shed any insights on areas that I kind of left you wanting to learn more. I do want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and as always guys, have a good one.